Now here's what some of the first guys thought that looked at this, and well, this is later. This is Harold Levin. This is a typical textbook from the 70s. One might think an assemblage of beasts that had proved their stamina against the difficulties of an ice age would persist for at least as long as did the dinosaurs. Yet widespread extermination and extinction was the dominant biological theme at the end of the Pleistocene. The cause of the extinctions is unknown. Now he's saying that in the 70s, and of course even then though the dominant idea was that humans. Yes, Jerry?
Couldn't there have been a microbe in space that they had no resistance?
Well, the problem with that theory, and that's been proposed, the problem with the theory is that there are so many diverse species, both meat eaters, herbivores, so widespread around the earth that they can't conceive of some super microbe that could affect that many different species. We've never seen anything like that.
Well, not just one microbe, but it could have been determined which microbes to set.
Well, bear this in mind, Jerry. If there is widespread habitat destruction, the same thing that happened to humans and the Europeans during the Little Ice Age, you diminish the food supply, animals get weak. Yes, there could be opportunistic diseases that contributed. That's how I would interpret it. But let's look at what Rembrandt Peale, one of the first great American scientists, said back in 1802, because I think he was on the right track. How long since these animals have existed? We shall perhaps ever remain in ignorance. Of course, that's not true anymore. But certain we are that they existed in great abundance from the number of their remains which are found in America. We are likewise sure that they must have been destroyed by some sudden and powerful cause. Now, he can't envision what that cause would be, but he's definitely on the right track, I would think. It is extremely probable that whenever and by whatever means the extirpation of this tremendous race of animals was effected, the same cause must have operated in the destruction of all those inhabitants from whom we might have received some satisfactory account of them. You see what he's saying there? He's getting at an important idea that was basically thrown off the table by later scientists, is that, in other words, whatever cause destroyed the animals probably destroyed most of the people that could have preserved a story about them. And Alfred Russell Wallace, one of Darwin's co-discoverer of the theory of evolution, said back in 1876, "We live in a zoologically impoverished world, from which all the hugest and fiercest and strangest forms have recently disappeared. Yet it is surely a marvelous fact, and one that has hardly been sufficiently dwelt upon, this sudden dying out of so many large mammalia, not in one place only, but over half the land surface of the globe. There must have been some physical cause for this great change, and it must have been a cause capable of acting almost simultaneously over large portions of the Earth's surface." Now these are the words of the first scientists that are looking at this phenomena. It's later scientists that have who gotten scared away from the idea of catastrophe. And so they had to go to these absurd scenarios of Paleo-Indian hunters. William Buckland said, another great scientist, one of the founding father of paleontology, he asked this: how is it possible to explain the general dispersion of all these remains, but by admitting that the elephants, as well as all the other creatures whose bones are buried with them, were the antediluvian inhabitants of the extensive tracts of country over which we have been tracing them, and that they were all destroyed together by the waters of the same inundation which produced the deposits of loam and gravel in which they are embedded. Now, unlike modern paleontologists, they make no connection between the extinction and the type of deposits that they're found in. And yet, Buckland was seeing clearly, well, look, here is the animal remains found within loam or gravel that would have been deposited by a great rush of water. Clearly there's a connection between the extinction and disappearance of these animals and the conditions in which we are finding their remains. And yet 20th century paleontology basically refused to admit that connection. And if you read the literature, every time they ignore the context in which the animal remains are found within the discussion of what caused the extinction. We're going to skip some of this. I want to get to the new stuff. How much time we got left, Sam?
We got about 20 minutes yet.
Okay. First, let me show you the new evidence. That's what I'm trying to get through here. Get past the old stuff, because the irony is that the 19th century guys were closer to the truth than most of the 20th century guys. And it's only like in the last decade or so, with the admittance of catastrophe, that the modern guys are getting back to what I think is the truth. Oh, this is some interesting stuff, but we don't have time for it. And you've seen some of it, so I'm going to jump ahead to the new stuff, the work of Richard Firestone, and let's see here. You know, this is nothing. This is just talking about the instantly frozen woolly mammoth carcasses. Okay. Notice what it says here. This is the giant Pleistocene lion, the mega-lion, Panthera atrox, found up in the Yukon Territory in northern Alaska. So he goes in here. He made an arrangement to collect mammal remains in the course of placer mining on Quartz Creek and Dominion Creeks. The bones came from frozen silt, generally consisting of loess or reworked loess with some organic matter. Late Pleistocene mammal remains are usually found in stratigraphically similar situations throughout the region. And here we come to the Hot Springs Mammoth Site, in which over 50 mammoth skeletons have been unearthed so far. And I'm asking the rhetorical question, gradual accumulation or sudden burial? This is an ongoing excavation even as we speak. I imagine they shut it down in the winter, but they probably have an excavating season. So you have all of these mammoths, and probably there's way more than 50 of them because they've probably only discovered a few of them. And what's interesting is that if you read the literature on this, what they say is that there was a watering hole, and over many, many centuries, first one mammoth would come in and he would get stuck in the water hole. And he would flail around, and finally he would, give up, and he'd die in the water hole. And maybe 10 years or 20 years later, another one of these big dumb mammoths would come along, and he'd go into the water hole, and he'd get stuck and couldn't get out. And so after a period of 1,000 years or something, this watering hole collected all these remains of woolly mammoths.
It's so lame.
But yeah, that's exactly what they said, though.
Throw that dirt, get in there to cover them up. Where's all the dirt coming from to cover them up?
Well, in one of the articles, and I thought I had a quote, but I guess I don't. There's one article in which they're discussing that. And the guy says, but on the other hand, they do have the appearance, it is possible that they were floated in a bloated condition, which I find much, much more believable than these really dumb, retarded mammoths wandering into the water hole and getting stuck. And then, of course, we have our famous quick-frozen Borisovka mammoth, which you've already seen. You've already seen all of this, right? I don't want to reiterate this because I'm sure you remember all the facts. This guy's testimony is definitely worth reading, which ignored totally by mainstream science. What he did was he followed these guys, not necessarily these two guys, but the placer mining operations where they use these high-pressure hydraulic pumps to blow away the silt and expose the gold-bearing strata. And in the process of doing that, they also expose these bones. So what this guy here, Frank Hibben, did was he spent several seasons going with these placer mining, so he would be there when they would blast their way through this muck so he could see what, the animal remains and fossil remains that were in this muck. And his description of what he found is really, to me, some of the most compelling eyewitness accounts. And again, it's so at contrast with the prevailing dogmas that his accounts have been completely ignored by the mainstream paleontologists. But here's what he had to say. The Pleistocene period ended in death. This was no ordinary extinction of a vague geological period which fizzled to an uncertain end. This death was catastrophic and all-inclusive. The large animals that had given the name to the period became extinct. Their death marked the end of the era. But how did they die? What caused the extinction of 40 million animals? In this particular case, the death was of such colossal proportions as to be staggering to contemplate. Who or what killed the Pleistocene animals is a query that has not yet been answered. The corpus delicti of the deceased in this mystery may be found almost anywhere. Their bones lie bleaching in the sands of Florida and in the gravels of New Jersey. They weather out of the dry terraces of Texas and protrude from the sticky ooze of the tar pits of Wilshire Boulevard. Thousands of these remains have been encountered in Mexico and even South America. The bodies lie as articulated skeletons revealed by dust storms, or as isolated bones and fragments in ditches and canals. The bodies of the victims are everywhere in evidence. In spite of the indications that a few animals escaped the tragedy, there is no doubt that the major portion of the great animals of the Pleistocene met their end at the same time. It might at first appear that many of these great animals died natural deaths. That is, that the remains that we find in the Pleistocene strata over the continent represent the normal death that ends the ordinary life cycle. However, where we can study these animals in some detail, such as in the great bone deposits of Nebraska, we find literally thousands of these remains together. The young lie with the old, foal with dam, and calf with cow. Whole herds of animals were apparently killed together, overcome by some common power. And I've got that underlined because that's ultimately what we're looking for in this mystery. What is the some common power at work here? And of course, we've offered several conjectures as to that. Now, interspersed in the muck depths, and sometimes in the very piles of bones and tusks themselves, are layers of volcanic ash. There is no doubt that coincidental with the end of the Pleistocene animals, at least in Alaska, there were volcanic eruptions of tremendous proportions. Throughout the Alaskan mucks, there is evidence of atmospheric disturbance of unparalleled violence. Now, this is very critical to trying to get to the bottom of this mystery. Mammoth and bison alike were torn and twisted as though by a cosmic hand in godly rage. In one place, we can find the foreleg and shoulder of a mammoth with portions of the flesh and the toenails and the hair still clinging to the blackened bones. Close by is the neck and skull of a bison with the vertebrae clinging together with tendons and ligaments and the chitinous covering of the horns intact. There is no mark of a knife or cutting implement. The animals were simply torn apart and scattered over the landscape like things of straw and string. Mixed with the piles of bones are trees, also twisted and torn and piled in tangled groups, and the whole is covered with the fine sifting muck and then frozen solid. Now you can see why the mainstream paleontologists have ignored testimony such as this. Because clearly you now have to make a connection between the condition in which the remains are found and the question of the extinction of the species. And that's what they have avoided doing like the plague. Because if you do that, when you start describing this kind of a situation, clearly Humans had nothing to do with it, did they? No. But there's a whole segment of the modern environmentalist movement that likes to invoke humans as being the detrimental cause throughout natural history. As long as we've been here on the earth, we've been destroying stuff. And one of the pieces of evidence that they bring up is this right here, and I can actually send you to some websites of some, paleontological professors who, that's their whole concept is that humans caused this extermination. And therefore, it proves that, how diabolical humans are.
Well, they are pretty stupid.
Now, before I do that, the godfather of the overkill hypothesis, the guy who first really scientifically proposed that humans were responsible, was this guy, Paul Martin. In his 1967 paper, Pleistocene Extinctions, The Search for a Cause, that he presented at the 7th Congress of the International Association of Quaternary Research, this is what he said. Pleistocene geologists are not the only ones who have a good deal at stake in understanding what caused extinction at the end of the glacial period. If climatic change was responsible, then it must have been a change of a magnitude not known previously. Are meteorologists prepared to recognize the possibility of a climatic shock wave of unprecedented dimension within the last 15,000 years? He asked that question, and of course his conclusion was, in 1967, no, they weren't. Absolutely, they were not. And so they dismissed that possibility of there being a climatic catastrophe. And from that point forward, human beings have gotten the blame. But here's another guy writing in 1983. It can be argued that because of their timing, these extinctions represent a single event, and that because of its impact, it is the most drastic ecological catastrophe noted in the Quaternary record of the Western Hemisphere. The number of latest glacial generic extinctions of large mammals exceeds the number of genera lost during the preceding 3 million years. So in other words, if you take the genera of large animals exterminated 12,000 years ago, it exceeds the total number of animal species that disappeared during the previous 3 million years. And there you can see the graph, and you see that you've seen this before, the major spike that occurs at the end of the glacial period. In fact, I would like to see this goes to the 80s. I'd like to see an updated version of this because I have a strong suspicion that what we're beginning to see the possibility here is that there might have actually been 2 spikes.
To match 2 spikes on them.
Yes. And you can actually see here what appears like it could be 2 spikes separated by about 1,000 years.
So would it have taken out a certain group of species at first and a different?
Well, what it would have done was destroyed a lot of habitat, caused enormous climate changes that would have made it difficult for the survivors to recover and expand their population numbers. Then the second blow comes along, and basically that's the coup de grace. And of course, there's the Lenape stone, which I think probably is a depiction of the woolly mammoths, the thunder stones being hurled from the sky, the decimation of the forests. You've seen that before. The Oralton Farms mastodon, you've seen that. Remember the mastodon that got crushed? Have you seen that? Yeah, right. And then, of course, they asked the question, this was the one where the animal was just blasted over so hard that he was ripped right, his foot was sunk into mud, and the rest of the mammoth got flattened, but where he was stepping at the time the blast hit him, his foot was still there, depressed into the mud, severed from his leg. That would have hurt, yes. And then, of course, way back in the 50s, the guy did admit that there was some considerable force. That's an understatement. And then he goes on to ask as to any conclusion as to an agency powerful enough to cause such destruction must be highly speculative.
Were
That's up in Ohio. It was near the glacier margin at the end of the last ice age. And then what? Yes, well this was this was Thomas Jefferson, and this is the account of when he got told the story by the Delaware Indians. And so like this guy here, he's asking, well, any conclusion as to an agency powerful enough? Well, if he had known to go to Jefferson's Notes on Virginia and read, he would have found that the Delaware Indians already knew. And they told the story to Thomas Jefferson, and he wrote it down. We've read this, so I'm going to, yes, here, right here. In ancient times, a herd of these tremendous animals came to the big bone licks and began a universal destruction of the bear, deer, elks, buffaloes, and other animals which had been created for the use of the Indian. The great man above, looking down and seeing this, was so enraged that he seized his lightning, descended on the earth, seated himself on a neighboring mountain, on a rock of which his seat and the print of his feet are still to be seen, and hurled his bolts among them till the whole were slaughtered. Now what is the bolts? What were the Indians talking about here? The old man above hurling his bolts, his thunderbolts.
Lightning.
Well,
Comets.
Comets or something.
Zeus gets around.
well, here's your dogma right here. This was a glossy book written on mammoths in 1994 by two paleontologists. And they say there are a number of places, especially in Siberia, where large numbers of mammoth bones have accumulated. Over thousands of years, individual mammoths died while walking along river valleys or by falling through ice, and their bones were eventually brought together by flowing waters in gullies, backwaters, and oxbow lakes. The Barilek Cemetery is probably the product of numerous individual accidents that occurred over many centuries. So you see their little rhetorical device here, how they get around connecting. Well, these were just the normal. Over thousands of years, they died while walking along riverbanks. But we know from studying modern elephants that remains don't exist in nature more than 5 years. Even in an arid environment like Africa, elephants that died in the 80s during the droughts at these watering holes or that were slaughtered by poachers, the paleontologists that studied their remains reported that within 5 years, even the huge elephant skeletons were gone. They'd been recycled. So how is it that over thousands of years, you could accumulate thousands of skeletons and and then they're all buried at once? Well, let me get to the, okay. Major scientific evidence. Here's Pleistocene ungulates from the Bow River gravels. This is up in Alberta. Now notice again, gravels, Charles. One of the most prevalent places these remains are found is in gravels, in loams, in muck, in peat bogs, every one of which is almost certainly attributed to deposition by water, right? But in addition, we find the presence of carbonized, scorched, and charred areas on the bones. Charred areas on the axis and within the cancellous bone of the humerus indicates that fire had touched the bones. This most likely resulted from a forest fire. Now, this is a common occurrence amongst many of these bones and animal remains that are found. Evidence of scorching and of fire. And yet they're being deposited in water remains. And we could go through many examples. Here we find a mastodon found in a gravel pit. The Pleistocene lion found in a gravel pit. See, they were shoveling gravel in a pit. Yes, right here. To become a fossil, an animal has to be buried very quickly after dying and remained buried. Okay, now. So, going on, what do we got, 5 minutes left?
Yep.
Okay, 5 minutes is enough for me to finish. Going back to the Pawnee hero stories, let's continue with the story. After the giant creatures began to roam all over the earth, they gradually forgot about the Creator. Being so big and powerful, they did whatever they wanted. After a while, they began fighting with each other to see who was the greatest and most powerful among them. This led to many fierce struggles, and their constant fighting tore up the forests, dug up the prairies, and knocked down mountains. Because they were so strong, there was much destruction. Finally, Tarawa became angry with the giant animals. Stretching out a hand over the land, Tarawa called on the waters to rise. Rain began to fall, and water began to bubble up from deep in the earth. Rivers overflowed their banks in a great flood that spread across the land. Everywhere there was water. But the giant animals were so tall, so at first they were not afraid. But then their feet began to stick in the mud, and they sank into the soft ground. They tried to escape, but the more they struggled, the faster they went down, until at last every one of them sank beneath the water into the mud. When Tarawa saw that all of them were finished, the god waved a hand over the land, making hot breezes blow and causing the sun to dry out the earth. Next, Tarawa fashioned a man and a woman, but Tarawa made them smaller, not giant-sized, so that they would not be so destructive. They lived and multiplied, and today all Pawnees are descended from those two original people. Now, when the Pawnee walk along the riverbanks, sometimes they find giant bones sticking out of the mud. These are the bones from the animals that Tarawa drowned. They are there as a reminder not to forget the Creator. And if I have 2 minutes left, I want to show you this, the black mat layer. This is at the Clovis site we visited last summer. And here, it couldn't be more graphically displayed. There's the magic layer. Here are the bones that were in the lower layer, at the Clovis layer, of the extinct animals. And here are the bones of the modern animals. In separating the two, there is a period of time, a hiatus, but capping the extinction of the mammals is this black mat layer. Here you can see the extinct animal bones, the modern animal bones. Right on top of the layer containing the extinct animal bones is the black mat. The Clovis artifacts are found below the black mat, but never above it. It's what's in that black mat that provides us the clues to the mystery. A carbon-rich black layer, commonly referred to as a black mat, with a basal age of approximately 12,900 years ago, has been identified at over 50 sites across North America. The age of the base of the black mat coincides with the abrupt onset of Younger-Dryas cooling and megafaunal extinctions in North America. In situ bones of extinct animals and birds and Clovis tool assemblages occur below the black mat, but not within it or above it. In this paper, we provide evidence for an ejecta layer at the base of the black mat from an extraterrestrial impact event 12,900 years ago. And I've got 3 photographs to show you here. When these scientists actually started taking a closer look at some of the bones and the tusks, here's a mammoth tusk with 7 puncture holes formed by hypervelocity impact of magnetic grains. And the arrows show the direction of travel. These magnetic grains came in at hypervelocity, thousands of miles per hour, in parallel lines, and the animal remains, they got embedded in the bones and tusks of these animals. And they're found South Carolina, Arizona, Alaska, Siberia, Alberta, Ohio, and they all got blasted by this stuff, these grains that have the composition of cosmogenic material, something from space. And here we see a photo of an impact particle embedded in a mammoth tusk. Now this is the smoking gun evidence showing. But now, when this, here, give me 30 more seconds. When this evidence has come out, here's what we see. The ranks of the defenders of dogma come up with stuff like this. This quote is from the website of Richard Cowan, PhD. He's faculty emeritus University of California. And this was what he says. This is directly from his website. New claim that climate knocked off North American megafauna. University of Washington press release, October 25th, 2001. I wondered whether to post this link or not. That's actually the wrong date. It's more recent than that. This press release is bad-tempered to the point of malice, contains unfounded accusations against opponents, and in discussing the North American extinctions ignores all the evidence of Pleistocene extinctions in other continents. Obviously, I think this is worse than useless in the sense that it drives science backward, not forward. But bad stuff happens, and you need to learn to recognize it. Now, this guy, you've got to bear in mind, is a defender of the human.
Look at what he uses the word opponents. He's talking in terms of war.
Right?
This is education.
Well, then he goes on later to say, a comet, he's quoting, a comet from a supernova killed off the mammoths? Yes, you read that correctly. More junk science from Berkeley, September 24th, 2005. Life's too short to list the things that are wrong with this idea. So I go on to say down there, apparently life is also too short to list just one thing that's wrong with it. So perhaps I say he disputes the presence of microspherules, magnetic grains, fullerenes containing cosmogenic helium, soot, iridium, and other proxies for cosmic impact found repeatedly at dozens of Clovis sites. But you'll notice in his refutation, he cites no evidence. He makes no scientific arguments. He just calls it junk science, and that's presumably all that's required to defend the orthodoxy.
Why don't you email him that? Your rebuttal. Why don't you email it to that guy?
To that guy?
Yeah.
Life's too short.
Life's too short to waste my time arguing this.
Randall, they found the black mat all over the world, or is it just in the U.S.?
Well, it's mainly in North America because that's mainly where they've looked. But they've looked at several places in Europe, and it's showing up there. We're done.
All right. Next one.